Deep within the frozen heart of Siberia lay a vast network of forced labor camps, designed to break both the body and spirit of anyone unlucky enough to be caught in their grasp. These sprawling prison camps were the ultimate tool of state oppression, bending people into faceless cogs. Within their confines, a hidden world existed, a world marked by unimaginable hardship and punishments designed to extinguish hope. For decades, these networks of forced labor camps swallowed millions of innocent lives, silencing dissent and crushing spirits under the iron heel of the Soviet regime. Prisoners, subjected to bone-chilling cold, meager rations, and grueling work in mines, endured unimaginable conditions, designed to wear them down physically and mentally. Yet, even in the face of such dehumanization, the flame of the human spirit flickered defiantly. Brace yourself as we venture into the dark heart of the Gulag system, exposing truths long concealed to confront a chilling chapter of history, one that stains the legacy of the Soviet Empire.
Let's unveil the secrets of time.
The origins of the Gulag, the birth of terror and repression. The concept of using forced labor and exile as punishment has deep roots in Russian history. Before the Soviet Revolution, the Tsarist regime employed a system known as katorga. This extensive network of prisons and labor camps, primarily located in the desolate vastness of Siberia, inflicted extraordinary suffering on those condemned. Convicts faced grueling work assignments in mines, all in the unforgiving climate of the Russian East. The system was rife with corruption, brutality, and inadequate provisions. Medical care was minimal, and malnutrition and disease were rampant. Inmates experienced psychological torment alongside physical hardship, separated from families and subjected to the whims of capricious guards. Katorga could be a death sentence in slow motion, but as a system, it had several purposes that served the needs of the Tsarist state. The sheer distance of Siberian katorga camps removed dangerous criminals and political dissidents from population centers. Escape was extremely difficult, ensuring societal order was maintained. Stories of the horrors of katorga filtered back into Russian society, creating a powerful deterrent to crime and dissent. Exile to remote, often Siberian outposts was another tool the Tsars wielded against their perceived enemies. While less physically brutal than katorga, exile brought its own unique form of misery. Political undesirables, intellectuals, revolutionaries, religious dissenters, and even members of the nobility who ran afoul of authority could find themselves uprooted and banished to stark and lonely Siberian settlements. This separation severed them from their social circles and support networks, often severing their influence within Russian society. For many, exile was a slow fade into obscurity and despair. Yet, Siberia was not just a means of isolating opponents. It ironically became a breeding ground for revolutionary ideas. Exiled intellectuals often formed close-knit communities, their shared experiences and isolation fueling radical theories and plans for the overthrow of the Tsarist order. Prominent figures like Lenin and Trotsky both endured periods of Siberian exile, ultimately shaping the course of Russian history. The practices of katorga and exile did not die with the fall of the Romanovs. The Soviets, inheritors of this repressive legacy, would adopt and amplify these systems on an unprecedented scale. The Gulag Archipelago, one of history's most infamous penal systems, would soon become the direct descendant of Tsarist labor camps. Revolution and the birth of Soviet repression, from Tsarist prisons to the dawn of the Gulag. The 1917 October Revolution, a seismic event that overthrew centuries of Tsarist rule, promised a complete transformation of Russian society. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, envisioned a radical new world founded on Marxist-Leninist ideals, a workers' paradise free from exploitation and oppression. However, as the dust of revolution settled, the utopian dream began to clash with the harsh realities of governing a vast and fractured nation. From the ashes of the old order sprung a new system of repression, one that would eventually give rise to the horrors of the Gulag. The years immediately following the Bolshevik seizure of power plunged Russia into a bloody civil war. The conflict pitted the newly formed Red Army against the White Army, a loose alliance of Tsarist loyalists, foreign interventionists, and diverse anti-Bolshevik forces. This brutal struggle for survival had a profound and destabilizing effect on the young Soviet state. The Bolsheviks, facing enemies on all sides, saw the world through a lens of us versus them, those who embraced the revolution and those who sought to destroy it. This siege mentality, combined with the Marxist notion of relentless class struggle, fueled a growing paranoia within the party leadership. Opposition, even perceived opposition, could not be tolerated for fear of jeopardizing the revolution's very existence. To combat threats, real and imagined, the Bolsheviks established the Cheka, the first in a succession of Soviet secret police organizations. Led by the ruthless Felix Dzerzhinsky, the Cheka was granted sweeping powers to root out counter-revolutionaries, saboteurs, and speculators. It embraced tactics of terror, including summary executions, torture, and large-scale hostage-taking. This unchecked and ruthlessly effective apparatus became the model for subsequent security organs, laying the foundations for the institutionalization of state-sanctioned terror. Alongside the Cheka's actions, the Bolsheviks instigated a campaign known as the Red Terror. This officially sanctioned period of violence was a response to assassination attempts against Bolshevik leaders and widespread unrest in the countryside. The Cheka and other revolutionary bodies unleashed a wave of retaliatory executions targeting members of the former ruling class, clergy, intellectuals, labeled as bourgeois, and anyone suspected of anti-Soviet activity. Even during the tumultuous Civil War years, early forms of the forced labor camp system began to emerge. The Bolsheviks recognized the potential economic and symbolic uses of imprisoning the revolution's enemies, turning class foes into a captive labor force. The forced labor experiments during the Civil War foreshadowed the exploitation seen in the later Gulag. While initially conceived as a temporary response to extraordinary circumstances, the brutality of the Red Terror warped the machinery of the Soviet state. As the Civil War faded, the terror apparatus remained, its focus shifting from overt class warfare to the elimination of hidden threats. The ever-present fear of counter-revolutionary conspiracies, deliberately stoked by the leadership, created an environment where paranoia and suspicion thrived. The death of Lenin in 1924 left a power vacuum that was ruthlessly exploited by Joseph Stalin. A master manipulator and deeply insecure, Stalin saw enemies everywhere. He took the tools honed during the Red Terror and expanded them on an unimaginable scale. Stalin's ascent marked the start of the Great Terror, a period of mass arrests, show trials, and waves of executions that decimated the Communist Party, the Red Army, and Soviet society at large. The Great Terror led to a monstrous expansion of the camp system. Anyone could become perceived as the enemy of the state and sent to the camps. The waves of arrests and manufactured trials generated a vast influx of prisoners, swelling the population of the camps. New complexes sprang up across the Soviet Union, fueled by this ever-increasing pool of forced labor. The camp's mission shifted from its earlier vision of re-education to a relentless focus on the extraction of labor under the most brutal conditions. Slowly but surely, the Gulag system was being established. In 1930, a simple bureaucratic change would have far-reaching consequences. The Glavnoye Upravlenie Lagerai, or Gulag, the main camp administration, was established. The word Gulag would become synonymous with the vast network of camps and prisons that came to define Soviet repression. The Gulag's new leadership had ambitious goals, creating vast prison colonies in remote regions to fuel economic development through the exploitation of convict labor. This marked a shift from smaller, scattered camps to massive complexes in some of the most forbidding corners of the Soviet Empire. Prisoners were shipped to the icy wilderness of the Arctic North, the deserts of Central Asia, and the sparsely populated expanses of Siberia. Some of the most infamous Gulag complexes, Kolyma, Norilsk, and Vorkuta, became synonymous with death, deprivation, and the relentless quest for the fulfillment of production quotas. The Gulag became integral to Stalin's economic programs. Some of the largest construction projects of the era relied on convict labor. Gulag prisoners were the backbone of far-flung mining operations, railways, and new industrial cities rising in previously uninhabited regions. Life and death in the Gulag, where the hope went to die. The jarring clang of a prison cell door slamming shut marked the end of a life and the beginning of a descent into hell. The arrest, often in the dead of night, was swift and brutal. Whispers, denunciations, or simply being caught in the paranoid net of Stalin's purges were often the only crimes. The accused would be hauled away from their families, thrust into a world of interrogations, beatings, and psychological torment, designed to break them into confessing to fabricated crimes. The interrogation process was a disorienting mix of sleep deprivation, threats, and promises, interwoven with endless questions aimed at securing a confession or implicating others. It was a Kafkaesque nightmare, where the purpose was not to determine guilt or innocence, those were already decided, but to force the accused to play a role in the grotesque theater of Stalinist justice. After weeks or even months in the suffocating prison cells came the sentencing. Trials were often a mockery, a formality where the verdict was predetermined. The sentence, frequently a number of years of corrective labor, was a twisted euphemism for the brutal reality of the Gulag. The journey to the camps was an ordeal in itself. Prisoners were herded into overcrowded cattle cars or the holds of ships, packed like sardines, enduring days or weeks of travel in unimaginable conditions. There was barely room to move, sanitation was non-existent, and food was scarce and of appalling quality. Many, weakened by the months of imprisonment, succumbed to disease or simple exhaustion on the journey. Those who tried to escape faced brutal guards and the unforgiving vastness of the Russian wilderness. The trains snaked their way across a continent, often heading into the far north or the desolate expanses of Siberia. For many prisoners, particularly urban dwellers, this journey was a first exposure to the sheer scale and harshness of their country. They passed endless forests, frozen tundra, and isolated settlements, reinforcing the sense that they were being erased from the world they knew. Upon arrival, prisoners were stripped of their belongings and any remaining sense of identity. Their heads were shaved, they were issued rough camp uniforms, and assigned a number that replaced their name. This dehumanization was a deliberate process aimed at breaking their spirit and emphasizing their status as mere tools of the state. The new arrivals were confronted by a bewildering and terrifying world. The camps themselves were often sprawling, ringed with barbed wire and watchtowers. Barracks were overcrowded and primitive, with inadequate bunks and little protection from the elements. The constant presence of armed guards, the barking of dogs, and the searchlights sweeping the compound reinforced the sense of inescapable confinement. The shock was overwhelming. Prisoners found themselves thrown into a brutal hierarchy with seasoned criminals, known as Blatny or Urki at the top, preying on weaker inmates. Political prisoners were often targeted, viewed as traitors by both the criminals and the guards. The constant struggle for survival, for food, for a better sleeping place, for a scrap of warm clothing, became an all-consuming obsession. One of the starkest realizations for new arrivals was the sheer scale of the Gulag system. In his seminal work, The Gulag Archipelago, Alexander Solzhenitsyn described it as a chain of islands scattered across the Soviet Union, a vast, sprawling network of camps and prisons, each a microcosm of repression. This decentralized nature made the Gulag seem both boundless and inescapable. It loomed as a shadow over the entire USSR, a constant reminder that anyone could disappear into its depths. Life within the Gulag was a relentless struggle against exhaustion, hunger, and the ever-present threat of death. From the moment the harsh camp bell shattered the pre-dawn silence to nighttime's fitful sleep, survival was the sole goal. Every day was a precarious balancing act, on the tightrope strung between meeting work quotas, appeasing guards and criminal hierarchies, and scavenging for any scrap that might aid in staying alive a little longer. Work was the core of the Gulag experience, designed not only for economic purposes, but also to crush the spirit of the prisoners. The labor was grueling, often manual, and carried out in extreme conditions. Days began with thin gruel and a meager hunk of bread before prisoners were marched out, under armed guard, to their work sites. Forestry was one of the most common camp occupations. Days were spent felling massive trees with handsaws and axes in the biting Siberian cold or the sweltering summer heat. Mining was equally brutal, with prisoners hacking away at frozen ground or laboring deep within shafts with minimal safety precautions. Construction, often on the grand and unrealistic projects favored by Stalin, involved working with primitive tools in harsh weather, moving earth and stone to meet relentless deadlines. The quota system was a constant source of anxiety. Daily work targets were often impossibly high, and those who failed to meet them faced reduced rations, or worse, punishment. The quotas were a double-edged sword. Meeting them might bring a fleeting sense of achievement, but the targets were frequently increased, pushing prisoners beyond their endurance. Exhaustion was the Gulag's constant companion. The relentless work, coupled with inadequate food and rest, turned healthy people into hollowed-out wraiths, existing on the verge of collapse. While the overall experience within the Gulag was one of misery, specific industries and projects presented particular dangers and challenges. The mines of Kolyma in the far northeast were notorious for their brutal conditions. Prisoners worked deep underground in dimly lit, poorly ventilated shafts, constantly at risk of cave-ins or explosions. Gold, uranium, and other valuable minerals were extracted at a staggering human cost. Major projects like the White Sea-Baltic Canal or the Baikal-Amur Mainline Railway, BAM, were built predominantly with Gulag labor. Prisoners faced relentless pressure to meet deadlines, often working without adequate clothing, shelter, or equipment. Accidents were common, and the unforgiving terrain claimed many lives. Some prisoners, possessing skills deemed valuable, were assigned to specialized labor camps. These could include scientists, engineers, or writers, forced to contribute their talents under harsh conditions and constant surveillance. While potentially spared from the harshest forms of manual labor, their intellectual freedom was completely curtailed. Hunger was a pervasive, gnawing torment in the Gulag. Food rations were calculated to be just enough to keep prisoners barely capable of working, not truly living. A watery soup of cabbage or gruel, a scrap of bread, and occasionally a sliver of rancid fish was a typical daily allowance. Prisoners became obsessed with food, their conversations riddled with fantasies of meals past and impossible dreams of future feasts. The meager rations created a brutal pecking order. Stronger prisoners with privileged positions could hoard food or trade favors for stolen scraps. Those who possessed any valuables brought from the outside world desperately bartered them for the hope of an extra piece of bread. Hunger turned people against each other, eroding bonds of solidarity and making the struggle for survival a solitary one. When the workday finally ended, prisoners stumbled back into the overcrowded, squalid confines of the barracks. These long wooden structures were designed for temporary housing, not accommodating the masses condemned to the Gulag. They teemed with vermin, lacked proper insulation, and were breeding grounds for disease. Finding a sliver of space on the tiered bunks was a nightly battle. Prisoners slept huddled together for warmth, their bodies aching from the day's labor. Privacy was non-existent, made impossible by the constant scrutiny of guards and fellow inmates. The barracks' stench was a mixture of sweat, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present smell of dysentery. Sleep, when it finally came, offered only momentary escape from the camp's relentless misery. Unmasking the Gulag: Punishments, Resistance, and Survival. The Gulag was fundamentally a system of terror, a place where the complete subjugation of the individual was the ultimate goal. Fear was its primary weapon. Arbitrary punishments, wielded with sadistic brutality, served to crush the will to resist. Yet, even in this carefully constructed hell, the human spirit refused to be extinguished entirely. Prisoners found ways to fight back, to reclaim a sense of agency, and to carve out meager spaces where a semblance of humanity could survive. The most common punishment was a reduction in already woefully inadequate food rations. Prisoners lived on the brink of starvation, surviving on watery gruel and scraps of bread. Reducing those scraps further thrust them into a desperate struggle against their own weakening bodies. Starvation wasn't just a side effect of the Gulag, it was a weapon consciously wielded to break resistance. Solitary confinement, known as the strafnoi isoliator or shizo, was a nightmare within the nightmare. Prisoners were confined for days, weeks, or even months in cramped, freezing, windowless cells on a starvation diet of bread and water every few days. Prolonged isolation, the sensory deprivation, and the constant gnawing of hunger were aimed at shattering a prisoner's mind and reducing them to a docile, animalistic state. Arbitrary beatings were a daily fact of the Gulag existence. Guards and camp overseers were free to inflict violence at whim. Kickings, whippings, being savaged by guard dogs, any imagined infraction from a sideways glance to failing to meet a quota could be cause. These beatings weren't solely punishment, they were meant to reinforce the prisoner's utter powerlessness and extinguish any spark of dignity. Whether for fabricated escape attempts, accusations of sabotage, or simply as a tool of terror, executions were routinely carried out. Sometimes these were public. Prisoners would be forced to watch the shooting or hanging of a fellow inmate. Such spectacles were a stark demonstration of the cheapness of life within the Gulag and the ever-present threat that anyone could be eliminated at any moment. Even in death, prisoners could be punished. Deaths were often registered with false dates or reasons, making it impossible for families to discover their loved one's fate. Others simply disappeared from the records completely. This denial of closure, the deliberate creation of ambiguity, was a final cruelty, ensuring the torment extended even beyond the grave. Despite the omnipresent danger and the overwhelming odds, acts of resistance flickered within the Gulag system. Whether in large-scale revolts or small individual gestures, prisoners asserted their will against the system that sought to eradicate their humanity. One of the most common, yet risky forms of resistance was intentional work slowdowns or sabotage. Misplacing tools, feigning illness, subtly damaging equipment, these small acts were a way of obstructing the relentless Gulag machine. However, such acts were always overshadowed by the threat of discovery and the brutal consequences that would follow. Faced with unbearable conditions, prisoners occasionally resorted to the desperate gamble of hunger strikes. Refusing the meager camp rations was a way to demand change, to protest injustice. These strikes were rarely, if ever, successful. They were met with brutality, forced feedings, and worsened conditions. Yet, these acts stand as a testament to the unbreakable spirit that endured in some, even when their bodies were at their weakest. Several major uprisings are etched in the bloody history of the Gulag. The Kengir uprising in 1954, for example, saw prisoners take control of a camp sector for a remarkable 40 days. Such revolts were often ignited by a change in conditions, a spark of hope amidst the endless despair. However, they were invariably doomed. Surrounded by guards, lacking weapons, the prisoners were brutally contained, their leaders executed, and their meager gains wiped out. For those lucky enough to survive the Gulag, freedom was bittersweet. They re-entered a world that had moved on, often unaware or unwilling to confront the horrors they had endured. Many survivors faced further persecution in Soviet Union that sought to erase the inconvenient truth of the camp's existence. The psychological wounds ran deep. Nightmares, flashbacks, survivors' guilt, and an inability to express the full extent of their trauma plagued former Gulag prisoners. Yet, many found remarkable ways to not only heal, but to turn their experiences into something meaningful. Authors like Solzhenitsyn became dedicated to fighting for the remembrance of victims and opposing totalitarian ideologies in all their forms. From the beginning, the Soviet system sought to minimize and conceal the true extent of the Gulag. Inconvenient prisoners were simply never registered as having departed, or deaths were given falsified explanations. The remoteness of many camps compounded the difficulty of discovering the truth. In the post-Stalin era, a partial thaw made limited acknowledgement of past repression possible. Yet, the full, horrific picture was downplayed. With the fall of the Soviet Union, access to archives and the voices of survivors finally began to reveal the Gulag system's scale. However, the struggle over Gulag memory continues. In today's Russia, there's an increasing tendency to minimize past repression, even to glorify Stalin as a strong leader. This makes the work of preserving historical sites, collecting survivor testimony, and ensuring the Gulag is not forgotten even more vital.